On Markham Street in Little Rock, you can find the Old State House Museum. Now it's a collection of historical artifacts from Arkansas's past, but it was once, as the title might suggest, the original state capitol building. It's the oldest standing state capitol west of the Mississippi, in fact, and over the years it's been home to the Arkansas Medical School, several New Deal agencies that operated in Arkansas during the Great Depression, and briefly, the Arkansas State Police. It's also the site of one of the most public and outrageous murders in Arkansas and, truthfully, American history. And it's that murder that we're going to explore today. But in order to do that, we'll have to travel back nearly 200 years to the very beginning of Arkansas statehood in 1836. So we're going to first consider the background of the state, then we're going to explore the events surrounding the murder in question and the trial that followed, and finally we'll take a step back and consider the culture that made the astonishing result possible. As any resident of Arkansas well knows, the state is often the butt of jokes. Arkansas, these jokes suggest, is a backwards place full of hicks and hillbillies, uneducated people who are to be pitied at best and viewed with disgust the rest of the time. Unfortunately, this is not a reputation that is limited to the modern era or the age of television. It extends all the way back to the beginning of Arkansas's identity as a territory. And there are plenty of people who had plenty of negative things to say. In fact, none other than the state's second governor, Archibald Yell, reportedly said, "Every man left his honor and every woman her chastity on the other side of the Mississippi." Now, it's debated as to whether Archibald Yell actually ever said this or not, but I do enjoy the quote, and it does do a good job of summing up the general attitude towards Arkansas in that time. And truthfully, if we don't have Yell exactly on the record saying this, we certainly have some other people, as we'll see. So where did this reputation come from? And is it rooted in any sort of truth? And sadly, the answer is it is somewhat based on reality. The first European settlers in Arkansas were French traders. Later, the Spanish also had some traders and stuff there. But settlement was very light. And, most of the people who were in Arkansas lived in the small settlements like Arkansas Post. There weren't very many of them, and they were mostly men. There were a few women, but that was largely the exception. So these men were trappers and hunters. They lived hard lives. They went out into the wilderness for weeks at a time. They hunted animals. They rendered bear oil, which, believe it or not, was the main export of Arkansas at one point in time. And they lived on the fringes of European civilization. So, by nature, these residents were often poor, poorly educated, and let's just say, less than refined. Anyone who had had trouble in more civilized parts, in fact, could find their way to Arkansas and perhaps escape scrutiny. In fact, many of the early accounts we have of Arkansas dwell on this issue with some horror. The noted English traveler George William Fanshawe, and yes, it looks like Featherstone Hall, but it's pronounced Fanshawe, he said of the state that it was home to, quote, gentlemen who had taken the liberty to imitate signatures of other persons, bankrupts who were not disposed to be plundered by their creditors, homicides, horse stealers, and gamblers. He further described the residents of the state as criminals, gamblers, speculators, and men of broken fortunes, with no law to restrain them, no obligation to restrain their vices, no motive to induce them to appear devout or to act with sobriety. So in other words, Arkansas was filled with violent, drunken criminals. Well, it's a harsh judgment, but it's hard to say that these early reports are entirely inaccurate. The truth is, many of the early residents of Arkansas were lawless, or fugitives from other places, or both. Many of them were violent, and certainly, especially in the territorial period, organized religion had very little foothold in Arkansas. Of course, there were certain features unique to Arkansas. Who could forget the legendary Bowie knife, the weapon of Jim Bowie, which was also known, of course, as the Arkansas toothpick? In his article, Arkansas and the Toothpick State Image, historian William Worthen talks about the contribution that this weapon had to the way people viewed Arkansas. He cites things such as a poem by a pioneer named William Queensbury. Queensbury described the attitude of a traveling salesman who had been to Arkansas and then returned home. Here's what he had to say. He was a wanderer in this land of sin, had seen most fiendish deviltries, had witnessed daily butcheries, the deadly toothpick jobbed and jobbed into the victim, stunned and robbed. Or, if frontier poetry isn't your taste, consider this review from the London publication, the Foreign Quarterly Review. This is precisely the spot to draw out in full the natural genius for gouging, stabbing, and shooting elsewhere restrained. Arkansas is the headquarters of Bowieism. A letter written in Boston in 1835 reads, "The good people here absolutely shudder at the bare mention of Arkansas. Bowie knives, duelists, horse thieves, Indian savages, frontiers, very awful. Not even fiction was safe. Everybody's heard of Moby Dick and Captain Ahab, but few people realize that at the moment that Captain Ahab's leg was bitten off, the good captain was thrusting a Bowie knife at the head of Moby Dick like an Arkansas duelist, according to the text." So it should be obvious at this point that the Arkansas Territory had a bit of an image problem. Despite this, settlers had continued to flow in, and the territory became a state in 1836, whereupon it immediately set out about the process of civilizing itself. This was not a smooth process, however. The young state had very low tax revenues and no real way to make more. There were also no banking institutions in the state, requiring even government business to be done with out-of-state banks. In an effort to correct this, a pair of bills passed in Arkansas's first legislative session established a pair of banks, the State Bank, or the Bank of Arkansas, and the Real Estate Bank. Both of these banks would be insolvent within 10 years. To make a long and painful story short, there were a number of factors that led to both of these banks being a failure. The first was massive corruption. And we shouldn't be too hard on Arkansas in this regard, because banking in general in the 1830s was heavily corrupt, subject to all sorts of mismanagement and wrongdoing, and very poorly regulated. So if the Arkansas banks made unfair appraisals and unwise loans, they weren't unique in that regard. Many banks of that era did. The timing was also very poor because at that moment, Democratic President Andrew Jackson was in the middle of a crusade against the banking system in general, specifically the Second Bank of the United States. He was targeting that institution, trying to destroy it, which he did. And so these banks were appearing and sort of coming online around the time of this major war against the banking system. And it turns out when you wage a major war against your banking system, you cause economic catastrophe. And that's exactly what happened in the Panic of 1837. So these banks emerged at the very worst moment and were destroyed by their own corruption. But I know what you're thinking. I promised you murder, right? So what's all this about banks? Well, we had to do a little background on the banks because the murder in question was set off by this very bank issue and the corruption attached to it. And this murder would occur on the floor of the Arkansas House of Representatives. John Wilson was the Speaker of the House. He had been born in Virginia in 1787, lived in Kentucky and Missouri before moving to the Arkansas Territory in 1818. He had lived in Hempstead, Clark, and Pike counties, had first entered politics by serving in the Territorial General Assembly, and it was here that he became Speaker of the House, a title that he retained once Arkansas gained statehood. He also happened to be the president of the real estate bank, which had already gained a reputation for corruption. On December 4th, 1837, Wilson was presiding over a relatively normal legislative session when a crucial topic emerged for discussion, a topic I think you will all agree is very important for the health and well-being of any young state, the issue of wolf pelts. I'm sure none of you can think of anything more important than wolf pelts. So why did this come up? Well, the issue was that there was a bounty offered on wolf pelts throughout the state. Wolves viewed as a dangerous animal, right? You need to get rid of them. So they would pay people to kill them and turn in these pelts. However, in true backwoods Arkansas fashion, people liked to cheat these bounties. They would kill one wolf and cut the hide in a couple of pieces and then re-sew it. And they would try to basically collect a bounty for multiple wolves from one skin. So the bill required that each pelt be properly certified by a county justice of the peace in order to pay out the bounty. Seems simple enough, not exactly a glamorous bill, but certainly not anything to cause a murder, but then things changed. It was at this point that Joseph J. Anthony, one of the representatives, stood up. Born in Virginia in 1780, Anthony had eventually moved to Tennessee. He had enlisted in the U.S. infantry and fought in the War of 1812, but he had been accused by his commanding officer of cowardice and desertion. Anthony denied this charge. He said that the only thing he had done wrong is fall asleep on guard duty, but he was threatened with a court-martial and he resigned his commission. Upset at this stain on his honor, he then enlisted under Andrew Jackson, who would later be president, and fought in the Creek War. In 1835, he moved to Arkansas, settled in what's now Clay County, and was elected to the House of Representatives. But all that's just background. For our purposes, what's important to know is that Anthony was a noted critic of the real estate bank. And so he took this opportunity to propose an amendment to the bill. He said that in addition to the justice of the peace, the pelts should also be certified by the president of the real estate bank, who was Wilson. In other words, insinuating that he was the only person honorable enough to do it, which was a sarcastic, sort of backhanded slap because he viewed him as corrupt. As insults go, it's not particularly biting or even really coherent, but it was enough to anger Wilson, who told Anthony to sit down. Anthony refused. Wilson then said that if he did not sit down, he would make him, and the two men began to advance toward each other, at which point both reached into their jackets to draw their bowie knives, or Arkansas toothpicks. There's a couple of interesting things to note here. Number one is that both men were carrying these weapons. They were carrying them into a legislative session where you would really not expect such a thing to be used. Therefore, it was customary and sort of speaks to the violence of the time for people to wear these weapons everywhere. Another notable fact is that no one who was watching could really agree who drew first. They seemed to draw these weapons almost at about the same time. People tended to focus on one man or the other, and that was the one that they testified drew the weapon. The event that followed was quite confused. Now, not because there weren't witnesses, there were plenty. This duel or fight occurred on the floor of the state legislature, which was in session. So most of the elected representatives were there, but the recollections are spotty and the testimonies differ, making it tough to tell what really happened. All we can say is what people said they saw, and this doesn't always agree. But the best reconstruction I can give you is this. The two men fought back and forth across the floor. One of the representatives, a guy named Grandison Royson, threw a chair between the two men to try to separate them and hopefully calm things down, but it did no good. Both just grabbed the chair with one hand and started stabbing at the other around it, sort of using it like a shield as they ducked and weaved. Anthony wounded Wilson quite badly, cutting him several times, especially on the wrist, which was very deep, but Anthony lost out in the end. Depending upon who you ask, either his knife was knocked away or he threw it at Wilson, but he lost the weapon. He then tried to shield himself with the chair, and Wilson hammered it upwards, exposing Anthony's chest, and stabbed him in the heart. Stabbed directly in the heart, Anthony died almost instantly. Once again, witness accounts differ. Some describe him as helpless. Others say he was fighting to the very end. The entire incident took 2 or 3 minutes at most, and now it was over. The Speaker of the Arkansas House had stabbed one of his own representatives to death in full sight of the entire legislative body. The shockwaves from this reverberated not only in Arkansas, but throughout the country, where this grisly event was widely reported. That it was widely reported cannot be doubted. Frederick Douglass, decades later, mentioned the incident, so it was well known. Wilson was actually quite badly hurt and confined to bed for a time with his injured wrist. A warrant for his arrest was not issued until 3 days after the fight. He tried to resign from the House of Representatives, but they refused to accept his resignation and expelled him instead. He was charged with murder, but his lawyers successfully argued that he could not receive a fair trial in Little Rock, and the venue was changed to neighboring Saline County. The trial began in early May 1838. It's hard to say that the trial that followed was fairly conducted. Official records, again, are slight, but accounts claim that Wilson reportedly stayed at the same home, sort of the same boarding house, as the judge in the case, and frequently went out fishing and drinking with him. As for the actual testimony in the case itself, as I previously mentioned, it was quite muddled. Witnesses couldn't really give a solid account of which man had drawn his knife first, and ultimately Wilson was found guilty of excusable homicide. And if you're wondering what excusable homicide is, it's basically a plea of self-defense. To celebrate, Wilson immediately said to the sheriff that he should, quote, take the jury to a dram shop or bar, and he would pay for all that was drunk by the jury and everybody else. After a night of raucous drinking, the crowd from the bar was said to have surrounded a house where relatives of Anthony had been staying during the trial, and this crowd spent the night shouting, riding horses around the house, playing trombones and trumpets, and generally harassing the bereaved. We know about all this because a kinsman of Joseph J. Anthony, James C. Anthony, wrote a letter to the Arkansas Gazette discussing these accusations, saying that all this corrupt stuff had gone on during the trial and all this harassment had followed after. Now, granted, James C. Anthony is not a neutral observer, so perhaps he exaggerated things. A rebuttal appeared in the next edition of the Arkansas Gazette, and this claimed that not that there wasn't a celebration, not that there wasn't drinking in a bar, but that James Anthony himself had actually joined those who were drinking, and he became rowdy himself. The report even said that he threatened to horsewhip somebody in the crowd who he believed hadn't drunk enough. Again, these statements may not be true, but they certainly paint a picture of lawlessness, corruption, strangeness, something that, just seems alien to us in our modern world. By the way, this did not seem to hurt Wilson's political career at all. He was reelected to the state house in 1840. He again served. According to one recollection, he again had to be restrained from attacking another critic who brought up the bank, and somebody had to hold Wilson back, but this has never been mentioned in the official records and may not be true. Wilson eventually moved to Texas. His first wife had died, so he remarried. He took part in the gold rush, then returned to Texas, and he died a decently wealthy man in 1860. Not bad for someone who had committed murder in front of the entire Arkansas legislature. So let's talk about how something like this could happen. And you might say, well, look, Wilson was acting in self-defense. The entire case is questionable and, it's infamous, but there's no reason to assume that he is definitely a murderer. Well, yeah, that might explain how he was able to escape being prosecuted, but it certainly does not explain his re-entry into politics, the general sense of acceptance he seemed to have from the jury, and the public at large. Let me put it this way. If you were sitting on the jury and you found that someone had committed murder in self-defense, and they said, hey, would you like to go out for a drink with me? You would probably say no, right? The jury didn't. And in fact, when we begin to look at the wider culture of Arkansas and the South at this time, some interesting facts emerge. Although dramatic in its particulars, the violence of the Wilson-Anthony duel was in no way an isolated occurrence. An excellent book which looks at this is by a historian named Bertram Wyatt Brown. It's called Southern Honor. And as he points out statistically, violent crime was rampant across the southern states. It was far higher than it was in the North. Even if you ignore the kind of violence that is embedded in the slave system and look strictly at issues of white-on-white crime, it was far, far higher in the South. For example, in 1878, the murder rates in Kentucky, Texas, and South Carolina numbered between 12.2 and 28.8 per 100,000 inhabitants. Looking in Massachusetts, which remember is the home of the large city of Boston, looking in Massachusetts at that time, the comparable number is 1.4 murders per 100,000. So you're talking about murder rates 12 to almost 30 times higher in the South than in the North. Many of these murders, as Wyatt Brown points out, were never recorded, never prosecuted, never really dealt with. And he asked the question. He says, quote, why was the law so readily manipulated? Why was English common law severity, and it was quite severe, by the way, so often and completely cast aside by judges, juries, and governors? Why were so many abuses condoned? And to understand that, we have to understand a really important concept that Southern whites of the era practiced, the concept of Southern honor. In this society, a man's honor and his reputation were everything. In the era before credit ratings or reference letters, the entirety of your personal and professional reputation rested upon what people said about you. And so when that reputation was challenged, when that character was attacked, a response was required. This often took the form of a duel or an affair of honor, where two figures agreed to meet in ritualized combat, say with pistols at a certain number of paces, and settle the matter. These affairs of honor would not always end in a death. They often didn't. They didn't even have to end in an injury. It didn't matter that someone died in these affairs of honor. It mattered that people were willing to risk their lives, that they were willing to stand up and say, my honor, my reputation matters so much to me, I am willing to kill or be killed in order to secure it. These duels were not confined only to the South. In fact, probably the most famous one between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton actually happened in New Jersey. But in the society of Southern honor, they took on their own life and form. The ideal was the rationalized, civilized duel, meant to be fought with rules among the higher classes. As Wyatt Brown says, duels provided structure and ritual. Referees assured the fairness of the fight, and witnesses reported back to the public on the impartiality of the proceedings. So in other words, this was all supposed to be ritualized, fair, civilized, but in reality, duels usually weren't. In reality, these violent outbursts took many forms. A street fight could and often did accomplish the same thing for the victor. Murder, or at least manslaughter, inspired the same public approval. Even planters were not above assaulting each other with fists and sometimes with firearms and dirks. Whether the combat took a prescribed form or consisted of sheer unchecked fury did not make too much difference if one or both of the contestants died. It was more common for violence of an unregulated sort to break out among the lower classes, but the class that was immersed in such violence, this lower class, tended to be those who sat on juries. So it should not surprise us that these juries often acquitted those who were accused of such crimes. Even judges who were committed to jurisprudence, and Wyatt Brown makes the point that Southern judges were no more ignorant of the law than Northern ones. They knew what the law was and how to execute it, right? But even judges who were committed to that often sided with what they felt like the local populace and the local jury would want. And those people who were steeped in this culture of violence and aggression were usually pretty lenient to those who dealt out such violence. When one's white manhood was challenged, the only logical response was to destroy the challenger. After all, it's what the men of the jury would have done themselves. One more example may be instructive. In Davidson County, North Carolina, in 1827, a drunk mountaineer named William Tippit got into a brawl with a much older man named Arthur Newsom. And this brawl was quite brutal. According to observers, Tippit bit off part of Newsom's chin, gouged him in one of his eyes, and then pulled the other out. One of the eyes popped out a few days later, leaving the old fellow with just one badly damaged eye remaining. In retribution for the damage that Tippit had done, a judge ordered that his ears be cut off. But the community responded with an uproar. They said that Tippit was a young man, and nobody liked old Newsom anyway. He was a troublemaker. The governor reversed the decision and allowed William Tippit to keep his ears. Which brings us to our conclusion, which is both simple and terrible. The system of justice in the southern states tended to back the winner. those who the community felt were most deserving, regardless of the actual criminal offense. So it's quite possible, likely even, that the verdict of the jury in the Wilson Anthony case can be as simple as this. If J.J. Anthony didn't want to be murdered in front of the entire legislative body, he should have kept his smart mouth shut.